This community is growing, and different groups are evolving. There's a meditation group now. There's a film group. There's all kinds of stuff going on. So if you're interested in coming along, if you're interested in joining this community, please get in touch. All the information we'll put in the link below. Dawn of Tantra is a book by Herbert Guenther and Chogyam Trungpa. And it was written sometime in the 70s. It was an attempt to give an introduction to Tantra, which I think is kind of needed because a lot of what we talk about as being Tantra is equivocal. We use this word to describe a lot of things, and some people mean some things by it, and other people mean other things by it. So I want to go right back to classical Tantra, to where Tantra comes from, and what is the philosophy of Tantra, and what are the practices of Tantra especially. And you could listen to my talk and maybe get something out of it, but you might also get something out of these images, which are tantric paintings. They're called psyche, and they're little cards, a little like tarot cards that you give people in initiation retreats. And these are very beautiful ones, painted by the German artist Anna Lieb Dubino. And I'll also put a link where you can look at all of these very special tantric cards when you're done. So I've used them for this presentation. And I've called the presentation Confusion and Wisdom. Chogyam Trungpa talks a lot about confusion as being the path, right? The path of Tantra, confusion, right? As much as wisdom. So maybe we can get into a bit about what that means soon. So I'm going to start with just a basic sort of the four basic axioms of Buddhism, which is a quote from Herbert Guenther, and gives you kind of the flavor of Buddhist, let's say, praxis and Buddhist thinking. They're called axioms, and an axiom, as you know, people who study philosophy, is a postulate, an assumption you make or you take to be true, which is a premise, right? It's not a foregone conclusion about something. So I like to think of Buddhist concepts as axioms rather than truths. There's also the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, but it would be nice to think of them as axioms as well. So Buddhism has always placed a great emphasis on experience. The four basic axioms of Buddhism are highly experiential in character. The first is that everything is transitory. The second is that everything is frustrating. The third is that everything is without essence. The fourth is that nirvana is bliss. These first three axioms relate very much to our actual way of going through life. We observe life and see that nothing lasts. We feel that being faced with trying to build something on this basis is very frustrating. Then we can think and ask ourselves, how is this? Why is this? We can get the answer that if everything is transitory, it cannot have an essence, because what an essence is, by definition, the principle by which something is what it is. If we started reasoning from the idea of an essence, we could not account for transitoriness, nor could we account for the constant frustration which we experience. Now, the continual frustration makes us feel that some other mode of being must be possible. This is where we come to the fourth basic axiom, which says that nirvana is bliss. Owen was telling me before the meeting that he was feeling extremely frustrated. And then he had a moment of blissfulness, where he just lost that feeling of frustratedness. So in that sense, he was already experiencing something of a Buddhist tantric truth. Okay, so Buddhist path, according to the tantric tradition, according to the Nyingma tradition of Tantra, which is called the old school of Tibetan Buddhism, and it's old because it's very much related to Indian Tantra. According to that school, there are 9 vehicles of Tantra, ways of Tantra, okay? And this might sound strange because Hinayana and Mahayana is not normally classified within Tantra, but if you take a tantric perspective, all of the yanas are within Tantra. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but there's Hinayana is normally called the narrow path, it's the path of renunciation and discipline, and it's divided into two sections. One is the vehicle of listening and hearing, which is the intellectual aspect, right? So it begins with studying. In Theravada Buddhism, you study a lot of text. You study the words of the Buddha, etc. It's has a bit of a fundamentalist flavor because you just read the words and you study. Trungpa says in this in the book that the path begins with an intellectualization. The next vehicle is a vehicle of the solitary realizer, and that's the arhat. The arhat is the guy who attains nirvana, right? But all these vehicles have a limitation to them. The problem with the arhat is that he's the solitary realizer. He's not there to help anybody. He's just gotten out of the game. Next, we have the bodhisattva, and we bring in a lot of altruism and wisdom and compassion. And the philosophy gets a little bit more complex. You have the Yogacara tradition, which Quinn wrote very elegantly about in comparing to Hegel. So this is and the Yogacara, or the view of emptiness in Buddhism, is considered the base of Buddhist Tantra. So you can't have Buddhist Tantra without, as we say many times in our community, Sutra. But the basis of Tantra is this experience of the emptiness of nature of everything. There's no essence. There's no abiding nature. Now, once you've figured that out, then you're ready to go into Tantra. And there's different kinds of Tantras, and the Tantras are divided into outer Tantras and inner Tantras. And so I was thinking about this, and I think everybody equates Tantra with sex, and that's fair enough because Tantra is, about sex. I mean, sexuality is the primordial, let's say, the primordial image of Tantra is sexual. Okay, so where does sex come in, and in Tantra? Because everybody in the West seems to think Tantra is exclusively about sex. Tantra sexuality comes in, I think, in the outer Tantras, but also in the inner Tantras, but different levels of sexuality probably. So Kriya and Shara Tantra are about the body. Mm-hmm. And Kriya Tantra is about, purification, purifying the body in many ways, and then cultivation. So purification and cultivation. And then you have the yoga, and then you start to work on the body in terms of the yoga. So you can see that the outer tantras are very much related to the body. And in original tantric Buddhism from India, you have the sexual images outside of the temple. So in a way, the way that the new Tantra does it, you introduce people to a lot of sexuality is how they perhaps did it way back in India, where you would work on all your desires and passions, and then you would after doing that for a while, you would begin to meditate, and you get into the Mahayoga, the Ana Yoga, and the more advanced forms of tantric practice. So it's a very interesting question because in the Tibetan system, they don't do sexual practices. They often do them on 3-year meditation retreats, not on weekends. So you have to go through these 3-year retreats before you would get to do Ana Yoga, where you would learn the Salang practices and the inner yogas, and you would learn, how to create enormous amounts of bliss in the body through sexuality, and you would have a consort and all that. So in one way, it's a very advanced practice, and on the other hand, it's very primordial and almost even a beginner practice. So I think it's kind of both. So anyway, you go through all of these different yanas. The Mahayoga yana is the developmental stage where you develop kind of what's called stable clarity, and You do all these visualizations, etc. We'll come back to that. I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'm not going to talk about Yogacara philosophy because we have an expert in this community, Quinn. He could probably do better justice to it than me. What it says is that, that the 8 consciousnesses, this is the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose, the tongue, the mind, the ego, the collective consciousness, which is like it's like a storehouse of all of consciousnesses, are empty. They're empty, right? And they don't have any independent existence or essence, as we said already. And Nagarjuna, the greatest logician of Buddhism, argued for a middle way between annihilationism and internalism, or you could say nihilism and internalism. So he relentlessly deconstructed everything, and he's probably the greatest deconstructionist. He would make all of the French deconstructionists kind of like blush because he deconstructed everything. That's what his philosophy is about. And then they came up with this thing, the mind-only school. And it was interesting that Herbert Guenther said the mind-only school means only experience. It's not mind like the thoughts you have in your head. Mind here means experience only. It doesn't just mean, your thoughts make up the world or anything like that. It means, so in the book, Trungpa is a very interesting writer because he's a very good translator, and he has these odd translations of things. And when you read him, it's really hard to know what he means. So he says sutra means junction, like an intersection of the spiritual and the ordinary life. So if we're talking about the difference between sutra and tantra, we could say that sutra is where we meet ordinary life. And tantra is translated usually as continuity, and it's like a thread in a necklace. So tantra is there at the beginning, the middle, and the end. It's not a linear path where you build up to tantra, and then you do tantra. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't, because it's called the resultant path, meaning it begins with enlightenment. Which is kind of weird because it says that enlightenment is the already present state. You don't get it. It's the already present state. So it's called the resultant path. You begin with the result. You have this kind of linear stage-based model, but that that's an illusion from the beginning. And you move up it in a sense, like by doing the practices. You start with discipline and study. You move on to meditation. You move on, and then you start to do social work. As a Mahayanist, you become the Bodhisattva. You want to help people, and then you move into the more magical, artistic world of Tantra, and then you move up to Mahayati, which is the highest jhana. So it seems like a linear path, except you start at the beginning. You start with the Mahayati, and if you can't do the Mahayati, you slide down and do the magical Tantra practices, and if you can't do those, you go and you do the Mahayana practices. And so it's the linearity of the path is misleading in some sense, but it's what's called in Buddhism a upaya, a model, an axiom that we use, even though we know when we've studied shunyata or emptiness that doesn't exist. So Rudra is let's say the devil in Buddhism, the demonic, or but we don't want to moralize about that. We don't want to look at it in a moralistic sense. So Rudrahood would be the complete realization of your ego, where you become an ego monster of some kind. So it's the sort of opposite of enlightenment, right? Rudrahood is ultimate egohood. But with the Tantra, we work directly with Rudra. And Rudra is divided into 3 parts. I'll just read this from Trungpa. The Rudra principle is divided, especially in the Hatha Yoga tradition, into the ego of the body, the ego of the speech, the ego of the mind. This means the fixation or appropriation of the elements of body, speech, and mind by the ego in relaxation and its security or expansion. In speaking of the fixation of the body, we are not referring to purely physical attachment, lust, let's say, as a purely physical matter. We are talking about the mind-body situation, the body aspect of our mind, the solidity aspect of it, which needs constant feeding, reinforcement. It needs continual reassurance that it is solid. That is the Rudra of the body. So this reassurance that something is solid, I think it's like the sort of materialism of Sam Harris saying everything is made out of atoms. It's like there's nothing but the physical in the world. Everything else is just fantasy. And a lot of people, it's a sort of a purely materialistic view of the world. That's how I interpret the Rudra of the body, but also the existential kind of like mechanical meat aspect of the body is the Rudra of the body. The Rudra of speech is a fixation of the element which is related to both the body and the mind, but at the same time is uncertain which. This is fickleness or wavering quality. I like this, fickleness or wavering quality. Uncertain whether one's foundations is the fixed aspect of the body, the physical level of the textures and colors of life, or perhaps the emotional situation of whether to love or hate. This uncertain wavering back and forth, this fickleness quality, is speech, or mantra if you prefer, the voice. The fixation of this is the Rudra of speech. So this quality of uncertainty, emotional turmoil and uncertainty is often related to the, in the yogic system is related to speech, which is kind of interesting. Emotionality is related to speech. So the Rudra of emotionality is this quality of, wavering speech. I'm doing it right now. The Rudra of mind is fundamentally believing that if a higher state of spiritual development is to be obtained, it has to be manufactured rather than uncovered. Rangjung Dorje, the great teacher of the Kagyu tradition, in his commentary on the Herbert Tantra, says that the ultimate spiritual materialism is believing that the Buddha nature can be manufactured by mental effort, spiritual gymnastics. So that is psychological and spiritual materialism, the Rudra of the mind. Psychological, spiritual materialism is a big word that Trungpa uses, which it's his critique of the New Age. And it's this idea that you can create this higher enlightenment, through self-effort. Whereas the practice is really to take away the veils, take away the fixations, uncover the truth, rather than create something from your own contrived efforts. It's an uncovering or a revealing. I remember reading Heidegger, and I think he says somewhat of the same thing in terms of what is an idea. An idea is a revelation, a revealing of something, rather than a constructed concept. It's a revelation of reality in its most real or poetic sense. So that's Rudra, and he connects Rudra to the three bodies of the Buddha. So the three bodies of the Buddha are Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya. And Nirmanakaya is the form body of the Buddha, the actual body of a Buddha. So in the beginning, you train the body and the mind, right? You do what's called tantric preliminaries or nundro, which I'll talk about in a moment. And this is really work on the body. And the next work you do is the work on the speech or the subtle body. And this means training the channels, the winds and drops in the body. And this is where usually you would do the karma yoga or sexual practices. Dharmakaya is the space body, and this is when the guru or the teacher or the master, transmits its mind to you. Yoga means yoking, and yoking means, your mind to mind transmission. They say that in Zen. It's kind of a transmission of the most subtle. I wrote "Not a Mere Emptiness" in a way to answer, Quinn's, query about how sort of Buddhism it leads to sort of shunyata, right? And this is the highest part of the Mahayana, and shunyata is the word for emptiness. But the radicality of Tantra, and this might be hard to understand conceptually, is the unity of emptiness and luminosity. Okay, things are empty yet they appear. So we work with life, we work with appearance. We don't just say it's empty. Often they say it's openness, clarity instead of emptiness, and dzogchen. And so even though there is no essence, there is playfulness, expression, beauty, ugliness, all kinds of apparitions, right? These are what all these deities you see are. They're apparent, they're energetic. We work with energetic appearances that come from emptiness. They're not solid or fixed like a Jungian archetype or something else. So in non-dual mysticism, often this is represented by the Yabyung, which is the couple in sexual union. Here's a wrathful, angry version of the Yagyum. There's all kinds of different kinds of Yabyungs. Non-duality means not one and not two. So you can see they're in sexual union, which means they're not one because they're still differentiated. But they're not two either. They're completely in an embrace. So sexual metaphors, sex magic, these are used in practice in Tantra, and passion and aggression are not rejected as they are in Sutrayana. They're used to be, they're alchemically transformed. In Sutra, we try to go beyond aggression, passion, aggression, and ignorance. In Tantra, it's an alchemical path. So we try to turn that into gold, so to speak. And actually, Rasayana was one of the original meanings of Tantra, I'm told, which means alchemical path, and Rasayana means a flavor. So it's like you mix together the different elements. It's very experimental. So the first three tantric vehicles are called the outer tantras. We already talked about that, they are practices of elaborate conduct and purification. And then the inner tantras include what are called the generation completion phases of practice. But before you do any of this, okay, you have to do the pre-preliminaries and then the preliminaries. So in my own experience, before I was able to, even go near the tantric practices, I had to do a lot of meditation. I had to do a lot of study. I spent a year in a monastery. I went through various stages before I could even get these pre-preliminary practices. It took a long time. So this is traditional Tantra. It's not the same as going to a sex workshop for a weekend. And I'm not saying that those things are bad. I think they're great and they're wonderful for people, but it's very different than classical Tantra, where you do 100,000 prostrations, 100,000 mandala offerings, 100,000 syllable mantras, and then you do this solitary yoga guru yoga practice, which is going to link your mind to the enlightened teacher. And also, it's very, very clear that Tantra is ridiculous. It shouldn't be practiced, and it's a joke if you don't do it with an actual teacher. You can't do it on your own. If you think you can, it's just fantasy. So you need a teacher to do correct, proper classical Tantra. And generation phase, which is the beginning of the inner tantras, is about visualization. And to give you an idea of the visualization, you visualize here, you have a deity, you might be visualizing this deity who's called Yeshe Shogel. You've completed the generation phase practice when your entire psychosomatic being is completely identified with her. So you would look at a mirror and you wouldn't see your own face. You would be surprised to see your own face because you're so identified with this particular deity. You're like, who's that? So you have to practice deity yoga until you have stable clarity in the deity. and this is replacing your psychosomatic perception, your perception of me as Andrew, so that it's not that you are doing the practice, it's the deity is doing the practice. What is the deity? The deity is your transmuted, transformed perception. You develop Vajra pride. This is another word they use, which means not pride in yourself, but there's this elaborate sort of transpersonal pride or something like that. I don't know if that's the right word. But it's not pride in the human personality. It's not psychology. This is a quote from Tinley Norbo. He says, perceiving is deity and the perceiver is shunyata. This is the wisdom deity, which is totally different from supernatural beings or eternalist gods, since it is influenced by individual ego or the objects of ego, because the perceiver is stainless emptiness. So you see shunyata, emptiness, and deity are one thing, and perception itself is deity, is divine, you could say. All right. Here's a quote about visualization from Trungpa. Visualization is a prominent part of tantric practice. One identifies with various iconographical figures, Sambhogakaya, Buddhas, Herukas, Dakinis. This is done to develop Vajra pride. Vajra pride is different from ordinary stupid pride. It is enlightened pride. You do have the potentials of the deity. You are him already. The magic is not particularly in the visualization, but there is magic in your pride, your inspiration. You are Mahavarochana. You are absolutely clean, immaculate, and pure. Therefore, you can identify with your own purity, your purity rather than that of an external God who is pure, rather than some kind of foreign element coming into you. You are awakening yourself. So Tantra is not magic in the sense of conjuring or involving oneself in a myth. Tantra is the highest level of process of personal evolution. It is the ultimate development of the logic that runs through the entire Buddhist path. Okay. So this is actually not a very clean deity. This is the Mahakala. He's has bloodshot eyes and he's eating human corpses and things like that. But so there are wrathful deities and there are also peaceful deities, and there's all kinds of deities. These kind of deities that are very fierce are called protectors. So completion phase comes after generation phase, and this is where you do inner yogas, including dream yoga. It's a big practice where you do practices in your dreams. Sexual yogas, and then hatha yogas come later, very very late in this particular tradition. Unlike going to the yoga gym, you work with the winds, the inner channels, the energetic essences of the male and female principles. So it gets more subtle as you go along, is the point here. And until you get to the Ati, or the Dzogchen. Dzogchen works with primordial energy. Rigpa knows this directly. One translation of Dzogchen is utter completeness, a state where nothing needs to be rejected or gained. Less dramatically, Chogyam Trungpa called it the old dog stage, or non-meditation. Dzogchen is expressed as total spontaneity or crazy wisdom, but not of the banal, ordinary kind. Enlightened spontaneity is not ordinary hippie consciousness. Dzogchen is not for neophytes or spiritual dilettantes. Okay, this is not a quote. These are my own words. But utter completeness, or he calls it the old dog stage, and this is where you become completely spontaneous and you've passed beyond meditation. It's often called post meditation or something like that. But we have to be very clear about the difference between just being spontaneous because of your impulsive ego, or spontaneous because you've gone through all these stages and then you're able to dissolve them all, right? Generating the deity is not the final practice. You generate the deity and then you dissolve the deity. So again, I talk about the resultant view, that you start with the result, that you start with the view that you're already enlightened, which is a view. It's an idea, right? It's not that somebody like me has that experience. That's the view that you try to hold. That's the axiom or the experiment you're working with. So you need, but with all of this, you need the sutric ground. So while Dzogchen is called the ultimate view, it contains all the other views in itself. It's the sort of end of linearity and the progressive path. And then Chogyam Trungpa talks about it as being a big blue pancake that falls on your head. He also describes enlightenment as the ultimate disappointment, which I thought was pretty good. All right. I also thought this was interesting, what Guenther said about sin. Because in the original meaning of sin in the West is missing the mark. It's an archery term. It's not a moralistic term. And because it's been so associated with moralism, Trungpa called it neurotic crime. So if we try to express the situation in traditional religious terms, we might say that man is a fallen being. But here he has not fallen because he has sinned or transgressed some commandment coming from outside of him, but the very fact that he has moved in a certain direction. This is technically known in Buddhism as Bharanti in Sanskrit, or Krupa in Tibetan, and is usually translated as error. But error implies, in Western thinking, culpability, and there is absolutely no culpability involved. One might tend to feel that we could not have done otherwise, but this attitude simply does not apply here. The process is a kind of going astray that just happens. The idea of sin is irrelevant. So it's very, it's not so, the Buddhist flavor of religion it's not so sort of judgmental as the Western traditions, I think, in terms of sin. Sin just happens to people, and then you try to correct your path. Also, the idea of a mandala is something that's kind of misunderstood, and I think Carl Jung misunderstood the idea of mandala as being the self, but it's more like the environment, the self and the environment. So a mandala consists of a center and a fringe area of a circle. On the basic level, it consists of the practitioner's relationship to the phenomenal world. The study of the mandala principle is that of the student in his life situation. So here you see a mandala with different colors, and in the visualizations, there might be a Buddha in each of these four directions and one in the center, and each of them would represent a certain quality. So the blue quality is the quality of sharpness or intellect. The white quality is a quality of openness or space. The green quality is a quality of action related to the wind. And yellow is richness. It's related to, it's called, Radna Sambhava. It's the richness, the primordial richness. It's usually in the southern direction. So this mandala is a bit different. And then the other one is the red, which is pink here, but normally it's red, and red is a symbol of sort of fire and seduction and so each of these different qualities make up the mandala. Each of these different elemental qualities make up the mandala. So Trungpa said and taught that shamatha vipassana, which is basic Buddhist meditation, it's kind of the king of everything. It's kind of the basis of everything. And it can be seen in all of the different jhanas. And it can be looked at in different jhanas. So shamatha means calm abiding, at ease with oneself. Vipassana means the cutting or action or more like insight. So again, we have this image of openness and insight, space and penetration. There's the sexual images there as well. Is already there in the shamatha vipassana. The entire tantric business is within shamatha vipassana, and here are sort of the inner channels and inner yogas which you practice, and sort of the blue there. So there's this idea of the red, the white, and the blue. The white is the male essence, and often the male essence is up here, and it's masculinity and it's lunar. So masculinity is associated with the moon. Femininity is down here. It's associated with the sun, and it's red. And the blue channel is the central channel, which holds the two together. So you work with these energies within your own body and with others. Accumulation of experiential process of the development of intellect is the experience of shunyata, which is the experience of non-existence of duality. It's interesting, like he says that the accumulation of the development of intellect is shunyata, right? The development of mind, of thought, is emptiness, is the non-existence of duality. The research work has already been accomplished, so I think this is where Tantra starts, at shunyata, the non-existence of duality. The research work is already accomplished. The process of searching for something has been laid to rest. This is the attainment of prajna. Prajna is also this penetrating quality of insight. And total prajna would be total, I guess, maybe absolute knowing in the Hegel sense, like complete reactivity, complete clarity. Okay, I just have a conclusion here. This is Chogyam Trungpa, who is a crazy wisdom master. I just found something out about crazy wisdom, which I thought was interesting. There's two kinds of crazy wisdom. And maybe you've heard that term before. Maybe you've heard Alexander Bard use it, and other people use this term, crazy wisdom. So one kind of crazy wisdom is, intentionally outrageous and offensive behaviors, which break the sort of superego or the mores of the society. For example, some crazy wisdom teacher would go into a monastery and shit take a shit in the monastery and have sex with somebody on the altar, right? That would be a shock if you were a monk, right? This is what crazy wisdom tries to break your conceptual mind completely. And there's a sort of one aspect of crazy wisdom, which is very, what they call the left-hand path, which is very antinomian, which is very transgressive, which breaks all the rules and laws. And there's a teacher in Bhutan called Trinley, Trinley, I believe his name was, and he had hundreds of consorts, and he hung around in bars and slept with prostitutes. And he was, and if you go to Bhutan right now, everywhere you go, there's penises in the doorway, which are supposed to be Drukle Klinle's penis, because he was loved. He was a folk hero. This is one kind of crazy wisdom, and I think Chogyam Trungpa, if you read about his life and how he behaved and what he did, he embodied that. The other kind of crazy wisdom is just breaking the patterns of reality, breaking the patterns of things. And I think we can relate to that a little bit better, if we're not such skilled tantrikas like myself. Breaking the patterns of stuff. Which cause something new to arise. So it could be very subtle. It could be very unpredictable, right? All these kind of wild, stories about people, they might be true, they might not be. If there's abuse involved, they're probably not true, But the crazy wisdom aspect of Tantra is like this. It could be just like giggling at a weird time during a meal. It could be something very something that's very surprising, that just opens up your mind, causes a gap in your mind, and you're like, what just happened there? And often tantric teachers do that intentionally. They teach in very nonlinear, irrational, sort of odd ways. I have some experience of that, and I can tell stories. Anyway, so I'll just read this final quote from Trungpa, and then I'll open it up for a discussion. So there's a widespread misunderstanding of Tantra, which sees Tantra as pop art. People have heard that this tantric approach is to accept samsara fully. The ideal has developed that before we are declaring everything, sexuality, aggression, ignorance, as legitimate and pure, that we accept the crudeness as a big joke. The crudeness is fun, therefore the idea runs, we can jump into Tantra by being crude and dirty. Since we have lived with the crudeness, let's consider it beautiful. But visualizing Mahavarachana is far different from the gesture of stealing a Rue Royale street sign in Paris and sticking it up on our wall. The whole idea of Tantra is very different from joining a club formed by tantric teachers in which it has been agreed to regard the mess of confusion as something livable and workable, to pretend that our pile of shit is nice, fresh, earthly soil that we are sitting on. This is a great misunderstanding.